In a bustling city where success and power are often defined by wealth, there was one man who seemed to have it all. He had the cars, the mansion, and the reputation to match. But despite his material success, he lacked something crucial: respect for others. This story begins on an ordinary evening at an upscale restaurant, where the rich and powerful dine, and the staff are often treated like invisible servants. It was just another night, or so it seemed. A young waiter, diligently taking orders and delivering food, was used to the routine. He had been working at the restaurant for years, moving through the ranks with patience and humility. Little did he know that this particular night would change everything, not only for him but for the wealthy man who had walked in expecting nothing less than perfection from those serving him. As the waiter approached his table, the rich man's eyes barely flickered toward him. He was busy on his phone, seemingly uninterested in the young man's presence. The waiter, trying to be professional, asked if he could take his order. The man's response was harsh, dismissive. He waved the waiter off, speaking to him as though he were invisible, his tone dripping with condescension. For a moment, the young waiter hesitated, the sting of the insult washing over him, but he quickly masked his feelings. He had seen it before: people like this, acting as if their wealth gave them the right to treat others with disdain. But something was different this time. The waiter did his best to serve the man with the same professionalism he showed every other guest, but the wealthy man continued to belittle him. He criticized the way the waiter presented the menu, then sneered at his choice of wine. His arrogance was palpable, and with each word, the young waiter's patience thinned. But he said nothing, just nodded, and moved on. What the wealthy man didn't know was that the young waiter wasn't just any ordinary server. Beneath the uniform and the polite smile was someone who had walked a much different path in life, someone whose identity, once revealed, would make this encounter feel like nothing more than a small moment in a much larger story. What came next was something no one could have predicted. The wealthy man would soon discover the true identity of the waiter, and it would be revealed in the most shocking and unexpected way. But by the time he realized who the young man truly was, it would be too late for apologies, too late for regret. The tension built as the night continued, and the wealthy man's behavior grew worse, each word more hurtful than the last. The waiter, still silent, finished his shift and walked away. But the story didn't end there. The young man, in a quiet and unassuming manner, was about to teach the wealthy man a lesson that would change his life forever. What happens next will leave you stunned, as the truth unravels in the most jaw-dropping fashion. Stay tuned, because what comes next is not just about a rich man and a humble waiter. It's about identity, respect, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming. The restaurant was quiet now, but the echo of the wealthy man's arrogance still lingered in the air. The young waiter, having completed his shift, walked through the staff entrance with the same steady pace he'd used all night. He hadn't flinched when the man had insulted him. He hadn't shown any emotion, even though deep down, each remark felt like a small wound. But this wasn't the first time he'd been disrespected. In fact, it wasn't even the 10th. It had been a pattern in his life, one that he had learned to navigate with careful precision. Years ago, he had come to this city with dreams, much like everyone else. He had been hopeful, filled with ambition and a sense of possibility. But that dream had quickly collided with harsh reality. The world wasn't kind to those who didn't have connections, money, or power. It wasn't kind to those who didn't wear the right clothes or speak the right way. He learned that quickly as he found himself working at various jobs just to survive. But each day, he stayed quiet, kept his head down, and carried on, focusing on the future he knew he could still create. The restaurant had been his steady job for the past few years. He had started off washing dishes in the back kitchen before moving up to wait tables. Over time, his skill in handling the customers and his professionalism had earned him respect from many of the regulars. Still, the wealthy ones were different. To them, he was just another face, just another servant who existed to make their lives easier. They didn't see the person behind the uniform, the person who had stories, who had a past. The waiter never spoke about where he came from. He didn't need to. It wasn't relevant to his job, and the people who dined there didn't care. But if they had known, it would have shocked them. His story wasn't one of privilege or wealth. It wasn't a story of ease or comfort. It was a story of hardship, sacrifice, and resilience. He had risen from a life many would have considered impossible to escape, only to find himself in a world where his true identity was hidden behind the layers of a uniform, and the role he played in the service industry. But tonight something was different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The wealthy man's words had cut deeper than usual. Maybe it was the exhaustion that had built up over the years, the relentless disrespect from people who believed they were above others. Maybe it was the feeling of being invisible, the feeling that no one ever saw who he truly was. He didn't know for sure, but as he walked home after his shift, a strange unease gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his path was about to cross with the wealthy man's in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The next morning, the waiter didn't go to work. Instead, he spent the day preparing. He had been planning this for some time now, though the moment had never quite felt as close as it did today. His apartment, a modest place on the edge of the city, was quiet as he moved through the rooms, gathering what he needed. He wasn't sure how the next few days would unfold, but he knew this was the moment when things would finally change. Meanwhile, the wealthy man woke up to his usual routine. He had no memory of the previous night's exchange with the waiter. To him, it was just another small, insignificant moment. But what he didn't know was that those seemingly small moments, those acts of arrogance, had consequences far beyond his understanding. He had no idea that someone had been watching, someone who had been biding their time, waiting for the right opportunity to reveal the truth. The wealthy man had always been driven by a desire for more. More money, more power, more influence. He had worked hard for everything he had, or so he believed. He had risen from humble beginnings, clawing his way up to a position of comfort and authority. Yet, somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Somewhere in the midst of all his success, he had forgotten the importance of humility, respect, and empathy. The young waiter had seen this type of person before. The ones who believed their money and power made them invincible, the ones who thought their status gave them the right to treat others poorly. He had seen them every day, in the customers who treated him like he was invisible, and the business people who couldn't spare a second of their time to acknowledge his existence. He had always kept his distance, never engaging, never reacting. But today felt different. It wasn't just about the man's insults anymore. It wasn't just about one rude encounter. It was about something bigger. The waiter had worked hard to build his life, and for years he had kept his true identity hidden. But today, as he prepared for what was to come, he couldn't ignore the feeling that it was time for the world to see who he really was. As the afternoon faded into evening, the young man made his way back to the restaurant. The wealthy man would be there again, dining as usual. The waiter's heart raced, but his mind was calm, focused. He had everything planned. It was time to show the world that appearances could be deceiving, and that a man's true worth was never defined by his wealth. The restaurant was as busy as ever when he arrived. The familiar sounds of clinking glasses, soft chatter, and the hum of conversation filled the air. He put on his uniform, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Tonight, he would do things differently. He wouldn't just be the waiter serving food. He would be the one holding the power. When the wealthy man arrived, he was just as arrogant as before, strolling in with the same air of entitlement. He barely glanced at the young man when he took his seat, too busy checking his phone to acknowledge the waiter's presence. But this time, the waiter didn't feel the usual sting. This time, he felt something else, something far stronger. He approached the table with the same calm demeanor, but there was a sharpness to his movements now, something calculated. The wealthy man barely looked up when the waiter asked if he could take his order. He mumbled something about the usual, waving him off as though he were an inconvenience. The waiter nodded, but instead of walking away, he lingered for a moment, looking directly at the man. "I hope you enjoy your meal, sir," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that the man didn't understand. The wealthy man looked up then, his eyes narrowing as he met the young man's gaze. For a brief moment, there was something different about the waiter's eyes, something familiar, but he couldn't place it. But just as quickly he dismissed it, shrugging it off as nothing more than his imagination. But the waiter wasn't done yet. As he walked away, he took a deep breath, preparing for what was about to come. The next few minutes would set everything in motion. The wealthy man would learn a lesson he could never forget. The revelation was coming, and with it, everything would change. But for now, the tension hung in the air like a thick fog, thick enough to choke any notion of peace or comfort. Both men were standing at the edge of a cliff, unaware of the consequences of what was about to unfold. What happened next would leave them and the world reeling. But no one could know how this story would end, not yet. Not until the pieces fell into place. The restaurant's atmosphere felt heavy as the young waiter moved through the bustling dining room. The clatter of plates and the murmur of voices were all he could hear, but his mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the upcoming moment. He passed the wealthy man's table once more, his hand briefly brushing the edge of the cloth covering the table, and he could sense the man's gaze on him. The brief eye contact earlier had been enough for him to know that something was stirring within the man, even if he didn't fully understand it. The wealthy man, on the other hand, had started to feel a sense of unease. The waiter's presence had lingered in the back of his mind since their exchange. It wasn't that he had thought much of the young man before, but there was something in his demeanor now that made him uncomfortable. It was as though the waiter was no longer just a person who served him food, he was someone who carried an unspoken weight, someone who had the ability to make him question everything. The wealthy man, though he would never admit it, had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to stay one step ahead. But the young waiter had slipped through his radar, and that disquieting thought gnawed at him. The waiter's thoughts were far from simple. As he moved through his shift, he couldn't help but reflect on the long years he'd spent trying to build a life for himself, years spent in the shadows, where his true self had been hidden behind masks of politeness and servitude. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little people like the wealthy man understood what it took to live a life like his. They lived in worlds where money opened every door, where status was everything. To them, it was a given that people like him should just fade into the background, mere players in the background of their opulent lives. The young man had learned to endure it, but as the tension between them built, a quiet fury began to stir in him. He had never been the type to seek revenge. But tonight felt different. For the first time, he could feel the weight of his choices pressing on him. Could he keep pretending? Could he keep his identity buried beneath the layers of his work? The idea of confrontation had always been something he'd avoided. He had learned to walk away from disrespect, to simply accept his place in the world and get on with his life. But something about the wealthy man's attitude had crossed a line. He wasn't sure if it was the culmination of all the times he had been belittled, or if it was just the way the man looked at him like he was nothing more than a servant. But the moment was ripe for something to change, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. For the wealthy man, the unease he had felt earlier was growing. He had watched the waiter a few more times during the evening, noting the way he moved with such precision, the way he carried himself with a quiet authority. It was in stark contrast to the civility that most of the staff displayed. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered someone who seemed different, but there was something about the waiter that seemed so deliberate. The young man was too composed, too calm. His patience seemed unnerving. And then there was that moment, when their eyes met across the room, when the waiter had spoken to him with a subtle tone of challenge. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it felt like something was about to unfold, something beyond his control. The conflict was deepening now, not just between the two men but within themselves. The waiter, struggling with his inner turmoil, couldn't stop thinking about the life he had built. The years of hardship, the sacrifices, the nights spent wondering if it would all be worth it in the end. And yet, here he was, still wearing the same uniform, still serving those who would never know what it took for him to get here. His past, the part of him that no one ever saw, was a world away from the polished, upper-class life he now navigated. He had come from nothing, had fought his way out of a life that most people wouldn't even believe. But no one cared about that. They saw only the waiter in front of them, never the person behind the name tag. The wealthy man's perspective, on the other hand, had always been defined by his wealth. His success had given him the ability to navigate the world in a way that others could only dream of. Money had given him opportunities that seemed endless. Yet, beneath the surface, something was missing. He had climbed the social ladder with determination, but he had lost something essential along the way. He had lost the ability to see beyond surface, to recognize the value in people who weren't like him. The waiter's subtle defiance, the quiet way he had challenged him with nothing more than a glance, was like a spark in a dry forest. The wealthy man didn't yet know it, but this was the beginning of a reckoning. As the evening wore on, the tension between them became almost palpable. The wealthy man, feeling the pressure of the young waiter's calm but firm demeanor, tried to focus on his meal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The waiter, meanwhile, continued to move through the restaurant with his usual efficiency, but there was a weight in every step he took. He could feel the eyes of the wealthy man following him, and though man's arrogance was still palpable, there was something else, something more complex. Then, as if on cue, the moment arrived. The waiter was called over to the table once again. This time, the wealthy man's tone was different. He still wore the mask of indifference, but there was something in his voice that wasn't there before, something almost like curiosity. He had been thinking about the waiter, wondering who he really was. He asked the waiter a simple question, one that seemed innocent enough at first, but the waiter knew better. He had seen way the man had been watching him, trying to piece something together. "Where are you from?" the wealthy man asked, his voice laced with a touch of casual interest. The waiter paused for a moment before answering, his gaze steady. "It doesn't matter," he said, his words short but deliberate. The wealthy man smiled, thinking it was just another evasive answer, another attempt at humility from someone who didn't want to reveal too much. But the waiter's response hung in air longer than expected, as though there was something more to it. Something unspoken. The silence between them deepened. The wealthy man leaned back in his chair, studying the young man in front of him, his mind racing with questions he couldn't quite articulate. Who was this waiter? What was it about him that felt different from everyone else? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the people around him, how little he cared to know. He had built his life on a foundation of success and image, and yet here was this young man, carrying a mystery that even his money couldn't unlock. The waiter, in turn, stood there, his gaze unwavering, his mind racing as well. This wasn't the moment he had planned for, but he could feel the weight of it now. Something was happening, something that would unfold in a way either of them could anticipate. What would the wealthy man do when truth finally came to light? Would he even recognize the gravity of his actions? The young man knew one thing for sure: the next few moments would change everything. The tension between the wealthy man and the young waiter seemed to stretch endlessly, like a taut wire waiting to snap. The wealthy man, still sitting at his table, couldn't help but feel that something had shifted in the air. The words "it doesn't matter" had hung between them, heavy and unsettling. Something in the waiter's eyes had made him pause, as though those words were a warning, a hint that the truth was more complicated than he could have ever imagined. But he didn't know why it mattered so much, why this young man's simple response had rattled him so. The waiter, meanwhile, felt the storm inside him building. Every passing second felt like an eternity. It was as if the weight of his entire past was crashing down upon him. The world outside the restaurant, the world where he had built a life out of silence and patience, felt so far away now. He had spent years learning how to disappear, how to fade into the background, and yet tonight everything was pulling him to the forefront. The man who sat before him arrogant, entitled, had become the symbol of everything he had fought against, everything he had endured. The waiter's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the wine bottle on the table, uncorking it with practiced ease. But inside, his heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about serving food anymore. It wasn't just about being the polite waiter who took orders and cleared plates. He was no longer willing to play that role. Not with this man, not anymore. Every part of him screamed to hold back, to stay silent, and do his job. But he couldn't. Not now. His patience, forged over years of disrespect, was running out. He could feel it in his bones. The moment was coming. His truth, the part of him that had been buried for so long, was about to surface. The waiter took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. The wealthy man was watching him closely, his gaze sharp, as if he were trying to unravel the mystery that was the young waiter. Every small movement, every glance the man made seemed to reflect a growing curiosity. There was a shift in him, a subtle change in his demeanor, as if the arrogant certainty that had defined him up until now was beginning to crack. He had sensed something in the waiter, something more than just a man doing his job. The waiter finished serving the wine, his hands slow but precise, his mind racing with the possibilities of what was to come. He had been working at this restaurant for so long, biding his time, waiting for the right moment. And now, the moment had arrived. He couldn't go back. There was no turning away from what he was about to do. "I'll be back shortly to check on you, sir," the waiter said, his voice calm but laced with an unspoken determination. It was the kind of calm that only comes when someone knows something the other person doesn't. The wealthy man barely noticed the weight behind the words. He simply nodded, distracted by the glass in front of him, still oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. As the waiter moved away, he caught sight of his reflection in a passing mirror. For just a moment, he saw himself not as the waiter in a uniform, but as someone entirely different. The reflection staring back at him was one of strength, of power. It was as if the mask he had worn for so long was slipping, and the man beneath it was beginning to take shape. Back at the wealthy man's table, the questions continued to swirl in his mind. The quiet, steady demeanor of the waiter had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. There was an air of authority in the way the young man carried himself, something that didn't align with the role he was supposed to be playing. It was as though the waiter had been waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to reveal who he really was. But who was he? The wealthy man couldn't put his finger on it, but the closer he looked, the more he felt that there was something deeply significant about this encounter. Minutes ticked by in silence, the tension thickening with every passing second. The wealthy man found himself growing impatient. Why had the waiter seemed so distant? Why had he answered the way he did? The casualness of it all, the nonchalance, made the wealthy man feel like he was missing something. But what? He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been triggered in him, a small crack in his otherwise unshakable confidence. Meanwhile, the waiter, now in the back of the restaurant, was preparing for the final act. His pulse raced as he changed out of his uniform, slipping into something else, something that would finally reveal who he was, who he had been hiding for so long. His movements were deliberate, steady. He had been waiting for this moment, for the day when he could show the world the truth of who he really was. And tonight, it would all come to light. The shift had ended for the other staff members, and the restaurant's usual rhythm was slowly winding down. But for the waiter, this wasn't just another night. This was the night everything would change. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach, the culmination of everything he had endured. He took one last look at himself in the mirror this time, not as a man who had to hide, but as a man who had fought, survived, and overcome. When he returned to the dining area, the wealthy man was still sitting at his table, his back turned slightly as he readjusted the menu. The waiter took a deep breath and approached. His presence was different now, the air around him charged with purpose. The wealthy man didn't hear him at first, too distracted by his thoughts. But then he turned, and when their eyes met, something shifted again. There was no longer any mystery in the waiter's gaze. There was nothing hidden anymore. The quiet strength in his eyes was undeniable. The wealthy man's stomach tightened, a sudden, inexplicable unease creeping into his chest. The young man was standing before him, no longer just the waiter he had dismissed. He was someone else. Someone powerful. And for the first time, the wealthy man felt his position, his status, his money, none of it mattered. He felt small, insignificant. And just as the silence stretched between them, the waiter opened his mouth, ready to speak the words that would shatter everything the wealthy man had known. But before he could, the door to the restaurant opened, and the world outside flooded in. It was a distraction, an interruption, but it was enough to cause the moment to slip away. The wealthy man's confusion deepened. What was happening? What was this? The tension was unbearable now, each second pulsing with a quiet fury. The door to the restaurant swung open, and for a moment, everything felt frozen in time. The sudden rush of cold air and the noise of the outside world intruded into the tense silence between the wealthy man and the waiter. People walked in, oblivious to the palpable tension that had gripped the room, the bustling atmosphere swallowing up what had been a carefully poised moment. But for the wealthy man, the interruption felt like a brief escape, like he had been given just a sliver of time to collect himself. But the waiter wasn't fooled. The moment was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel it. The universe had a strange way of putting things in motion when you least expected it, and this interruption wasn't just random. He knew it. It wasn't just the air that had shifted. Something was happening, a turn of events that was as sudden as it was unexpected. The wealthy man shifted in his chair, his eyes no longer on the waiter but instead on the new arrivals. It was a familiar face that caught his attention. Someone who looked out of place in this high-end restaurant, someone who shouldn't have been there. A man entered, his eyes scanning the room, his presence commanding attention. He was dressed simply, but there was an undeniable confidence in his step. The wealthy man's gaze followed him for a moment, trying to place him. Something about this man felt familiar, too familiar. The newcomer walked directly toward the waiter, a knowing smile playing on his lips. The waiter, still standing motionless, suddenly stiffened. There was no mistaking who this man was. He was no stranger. In fact, he was someone who had been in the waiter's life long before he ever donned this uniform. The waiter's breath caught in his throat. This man knew things that no one else knew. Things that could destroy everything the waiter had worked so hard to bury. The wealthy man watched in confusion, unable to piece together the connection between these two men. The newcomer approached the waiter, his gaze lingering for a moment too long, and then, in a voice that barely carried above a whisper, he spoke. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" The words landed like a blow, and the waiter flinched, his past suddenly rising up to confront him in full force. The wealthy man, still oblivious to the true weight of the situation, watched them both, his curiosity piqued. He could see the tension in the air, but he couldn't understand what was happening. The waiter, his usual calm demeanor now shattered, met the newcomer's eyes, the unspoken history between them hanging like a dark cloud over their brief exchange. "You should have stayed away," the newcomer continued, his voice low but cutting. There was no warmth in his tone, only a coldness that seemed to freeze the space between them. "You think you've left it all behind, but it's never really gone, is it?" The waiter's expression tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. He had spent so many years trying to outrun this part of his life, this man who now stood before him. He had done everything to erase the traces of his past, to become someone new. But this man, this ghost from his history, was here to pull him back into the life he had fought so desperately to escape. The wealthy man shifted in his chair, finally sensing that something far more complex was unfolding. He watched the interaction with growing curiosity, his mind racing to connect the dots. Why was the waiter so affected by this stranger? What history did they share? The wealthy man had always prided himself on knowing the ins and outs of everyone around him, but this moment, this exchange, was beyond his comprehension. The newcomer, sensing the wealthier man's confusion, turned to him with a sharp, almost dismissive glance. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice cool and cutting. "This is between us." The wealthy man, startled by the sudden attention, sat up straighter, his mind racing with questions. He had been a part of high society for years, surrounded by wealth and power, but this felt different. This was personal. There was something about the way the two men interacted that felt like the beginning of something much larger, something that was about to unfold in a way either of them could control. The waiter, still standing frozen, finally broke the silence. His voice, though steady, carried a weight that only the newcomer could truly understand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words thick with layers of meaning. "I told you to stay away." The newcomer's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. "You can't run from your past forever," he said, his tone softer now but no less menacing. "You've made your choice. But you can't pretend it doesn't exist." The wealthy man, feeling completely out of his depth, stood up from his seat, his heart racing with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. He was a man used to being in control, but tonight, in the face of this growing tension, he felt utterly powerless. He didn't know what the waiter and this stranger were talking about, but the look in the waiter's eyes, those were the eyes of someone who had seen things, lived through things, and survived things that the wealthy man couldn't even begin to imagine. The waiter took a deep breath, his mind racing, the weight of the past pressing down on him with suffocating force. He had spent years building a new life for himself, and yet here it was his past crashing into him with a vengeance. The man in front of him was the key to everything, the person who held the truth about the life the waiter had buried so deep inside him. But revealing that truth could destroy everything. He had a choice to make. The wealthy man was watching him now, eyes narrowed, sensing the gravity of the moment but still unaware of the full picture. The newcomer, his past now entwined with the waiter's future, waited, knowing that this moment, this decision would change everything for all of them. For a long moment, the waiter and the newcomer simply stood there, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. The tension was so thick that it felt like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Would the waiter confront his past, or would he continue to live the lie he had built? Would the wealthy man ever understand what was truly at stake? As the silence stretched, the wealthy man felt something in him shift, something he couldn't explain, but something that made him aware of just how fragile his world truly was. This wasn't just about a waiter anymore. This was about power, secrets, and the lengths people would go to protect their lives. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The tension in the room was unbearable now, the silence thick and heavy, suffocating every breath. The wealthy man stood there, heart racing, barely able to comprehend the web of connections he was suddenly entangled in. Every instinct told him that something was about to be revealed, something that would alter the course of the evening, of his life. But he didn't know what that something was. His eyes darted between the waiter and the newcomer, searching for any clue, any sign of what was unfolding before him. The waiter finally broke the silence, his voice steady but laced with a quiet determination. "I told you not to come," he said, his eyes fixed on the man who had brought his past crashing back into his present. "But you didn't listen. You never listen." The newcomer, unmoved, took a step closer. His gaze never left the waiter, and there was a dangerous intensity behind his words. You think you can outrun this? You think you can leave everything behind? It's never that simple. The wealthy man watched the exchange, feeling the weight of each word, but he still didn't understand. Who were these two people? What was the connection between them? The look on the waiter's face, the way his body tensed as if preparing for something catastrophic, told him that this was far from a simple disagreement. This was something deeper. This was about power. About control. And the wealthy man could sense that the waiter had been hiding something monumental. The newcomer's eyes flicked toward the wealthy man, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on his lips. This isn't just about him, he said, the words slicing through the confusion in the air. This is about you too. About everything you've built, everything you think you have. The wealthy man's stomach turned. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that his life was on the brink of unraveling in ways he never could have anticipated. All the wealth, all the power, the status he had fought for, none of it mattered now. This man, this stranger, was telling him that something was coming that would make it all meaningless. The waiter, his jaw clenched, finally turned to face the newcomer fully, his voice low but filled with fury. You don't get to do this. You don't get to drag me back into this world. I left that life behind, and I'm not going back. The newcomer's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just walk away? That the things you've done, the people you've crossed, will just disappear? It doesn't work like that. Not for you, not for anyone. The weight of his words hit the waiter like a punch. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. His past, which he had so carefully buried beneath layers of a new identity, was coming back to life. The people he had hurt, the choices he had made, were being dragged into the light. There was no escaping it. Not now. The wealthy man felt like he was drowning in the tension, struggling to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as it seemed like the entire room was holding its breath, the waiter spoke again, his voice softer, almost regretful. I've tried, he said, his eyes meeting the wealthy man's. I've tried to put all of this behind me. But it never goes away. And now it's here. It's back. Before the wealthy man could respond, a phone rang. The sound cut through the tension, jolting everyone in the room. The wealthy man's eyes snapped toward the waiter, who didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the phone. Instead, the waiter turned to the newcomer, his face hardened with resolve. Now is the time, he said, his words deliberate. I've made my decision. The newcomer stared at him for a moment, then nodded. I knew you'd come around, he said, his tone almost predatory. You've been running from yourself for too long. But now we'll see who you really are. The wealthy man stood there, still in the dark, watching as the waiter walked toward the back of the restaurant. The newcomer followed him, and for the first time, the wealthy man felt something close to fear creeping up his spine. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew that whatever it was going to shatter everything he thought he understood. Seconds passed like hours as the wealthy man followed them with his eyes, too hesitant to move. And then, just as he made up his mind to follow them, he heard a voice familiar but distant on the other side of the room. He turned, his heart stopping for a moment. There, standing in the doorway, was a man he had never expected to see again. His heart skipped a beat. It was someone from his own past. Someone he thought he had left behind, just like the waiter had thought he could leave his past behind. The man's eyes locked with his, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. I've been watching, the man said, his voice smooth, calm, and chilling. You didn't think I would let you get away with it, did you? The wealthy man felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about the waiter anymore. This was about him. About his entire life. The choices he had made, The people he had betrayed, the things he had done, all of it was catching up to him in the most unexpected, terrifying way. The waiter had been a part of something much bigger than he had ever realized. And now, standing in front of him, was someone who could destroy everything he had worked for, everything he had built. The man in front of him wasn't just an old acquaintance. He was a key to a much larger game, a game the wealthy man had never even known he was a part of. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and the wealthy man realized with a sickening clarity that this whole evening, every moment of it, had been meticulously orchestrated. The waiter, the newcomer, the unexpected return of this old figure from his past, it was all connected. And the realization hit him like a wave. The waiter wasn't just a server. He was a player. And the game they had been playing all along was far more dangerous than the wealthy man could ever have imagined. Before he could process the enormity of what was happening, the door to the back of the restaurant opened. The waiter stepped back into the dining area, but he wasn't alone. He was flanked by the newcomer, and between them was something or someone that sent a shock of recognition through the wealthy man's veins. The person standing before him wasn't just someone from his past, it was someone he had wronged deeply, someone whose disappearance had haunted him for years. The man's eyes, filled with resentment and pain, locked onto the wealthy man's with a quiet intensity that could burn. "Time to pay your debt," the waiter said, his voice now unwavering, as the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The wealthy man's heart stopped. He was no longer in control. And everything he had built, everything he had taken for granted, was now slipping away into a past he could never escape. The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air. The wealthy man's heart hammered in his chest as the figures in front of him began to blur with recognition and dread. The man who stood before him was no ghost, no passing shadow from a forgotten time. He was real, tangible, and above all else, he was there to settle a score. A debt that had never been forgotten, despite how much time had passed. The waiter, the newcomer, and now the man from the wealthy man's past, everything he had known and built was unraveling before his eyes. The man from his past took a step forward, his eyes cold and unyielding, as if the years that had passed had only sharpened his sense of purpose. There was no warmth in his gaze, just a deep, simmering resentment that seemed to burn through the space between them. "You think you've gotten away with everything," the man said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "But I've been waiting. Watching. And now, it's time to make things right." The wealthy man's mind raced. Who was this man? What did he want? What was he owed? The pieces that had been scattered across the night were finally coming together, but he still couldn't see the full picture. What had he done to deserve this kind of reckoning? The guilt that had been buried beneath years of success and power was now resurfacing, pushing to the forefront with every word the man spoke. "I don't know what you're talking about," the wealthy man said, trying to regain his composure. His voice trembled, despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "I don't know who you are or what you want from me." The man shook his head, a sad, almost pitying smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Of course you don't. You never did you? You've been so consumed with yourself, with your own success, that you never once stopped to think about the people you've hurt along the way. People like me." "People like him," he said, gesturing to the waiter beside him. The waiter remained silent, his face unreadable, but the look in his eyes told a story the wealthy man could no longer ignore. The past had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. And now, that moment had arrived. "You," the wealthy man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were one of the ones I left behind. The ones who—" He trailed off, the words suddenly choking in his throat. The memories of old debts, of wrongs done in the pursuit of his own ambitions, flooded back, bringing with them a sense of regret that he had long tried to suppress. The man from his past nodded, his expression grim. "You can't just walk away from people you've destroyed. You can't just erase the consequences of your actions by burying them under a mountain of money and power. The world doesn't work that way. For a long moment, the wealthy man stood frozen, his mind reeling. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, piece by piece. He had spent so long pretending that his past didn't matter, that the choices he had made didn't have consequences. But now, it was clear, everything had a cost. The waiter stepped forward, his face softened by an emotion that was both sorrow and resolve. You made your choices, he said quietly. And now, we all have to face the consequences of those choices. I've spent years running from mine, but now I realize that it's time to stop. Time to stop pretending that everything can be fixed with a smile or a clean slate. The words hit the wealthy man like a physical blow. The man he had been so dismissive of, the one he had regarded as nothing more than a servant, was now standing before him, speaking truths that cut deeper than any insult ever could. The waiter's life, his choices, his entire being had been shaped by the wealthy man's actions, and the reality of it was impossible to deny. The man from the past took another step closer. You never cared about the people you left behind. But I'm here to make you care. I'm here to remind you that the past is never as far behind as you think. It follows you. And eventually it catches up. The wealthy man felt a surge of panic. He had always been able to control the narrative of his life, to dictate his path with money and influence. But now, the grip he had on his life was slipping. There was no escaping what was happening. There was no way to rewrite this story. Please, the wealthy man said, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I didn't know the damage I caused. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was building something good. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. The man from the past looked at him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. It's too late for apologies. The time for explanations is over. A silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. The tension was palpable, like the final moments before a storm. The wealthy man stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do or say. He had come so far in his life, had fought so hard for everything he had, but now, in this moment, he realized how fragile it all truly was. The waiter turned to the newcomer, his face resolute. It's time. We've waited long enough. The newcomer nodded, and with a final, deliberate glance at the wealthy man, he turned to the man from the past. Let's do it. Let's end this. The wealthy man's heart pounded in his chest. And what? He whispered. What are you talking about? But the answer came too late. Without another word, the group turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, leaving the wealthy man standing there, alone. The tension had left the room, but the feeling of dread lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. The wealthy man stood frozen, his mind racing with questions, but he couldn't move. Something told him that he had already lost control, that the end had already come for him. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The quiet hum of the restaurant was now deafening. The wealthy man stood there, trying to make sense of everything that had just transpired. But there was no sense to be made. No resolution. Only the crushing realization that his life had been a lie, a web of lies that had unraveled in a single, chaotic moment. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The wealthy man's heart skipped a beat as he turned, only to see the waiter and the others re-entering the dining room. The air seemed to shift as they walked toward him. The man from the past, the one who had been at the heart of it all, stood tall, his gaze unwavering. It's over, he said simply. You've had your chance. And now we'll move on. The wealthy man's mind raced. What did that mean? What was he supposed to do with this new reality? And then, as if to answer his unspoken question, the waiter stepped forward, his face calm. You don't get to rewrite the past. You don't get to erase what you've done, but you can change how you move forward. The wealthy man's chest tightened, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his own humanity, the weight of choices made and consequences faced. He had been given the opportunity to learn, to face what he had ignored for so long. Maybe it's time I stopped running, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And with that, the story came full circle. The wealthy man, once so sure of his place in the world, was now learning that power could only go so far. That in the end, it was the choices we make, the people we hurt, and the consequences we try to avoid that truly define us. As the group left the restaurant, the wealthy man remained behind, a changed man, standing alone in the aftermath of everything he had done. And as the door swung shut behind them, it wasn't just the night that closed. It was a chapter of his life that would never be the same again.